Phasers have been a staple of Star Trek since the original series. They may look similar to typical laser weapons seen in a lot of sci-fi, but they're actually much more powerful and complicated. Starting with archaic lasers, Starfleet weapons evolved into early phase pistols and phase cannons in the 22nd century, which led to the standard handheld and ship-mounted phasers that we've seen since. If you ignore the laser weapons that Pike's crew used in the first pilot, though you can argue that laser was just used at this time as an anachronism for phaser, similar to calling them guns. These devices have been made in many different varieties and have several interesting features that rarely come up in the franchise. Here, we're going to look at some of the most outstanding facts about phaser technology and learn everything we can about Starfleet's main weapon along the way. With all that being said, I'm Bree from TrekCulture, and here are 10 things that you didn't know about phasers. Number 10. Phaser overloads. Phasers require a huge amount of energy to function, and if one is configured to release all of its stored energy at once, it will overload, emitting a high-pitched noise and exploding violently. Someone attempted to assassinate Captain Kirk by hiding a phaser set to overload in his cabin in the episode The Conscience of the King. Upon hearing the distinctive sound, Kirk began ordering an evacuation of the whole deck and calling for a double red alert, which is like twice as bad as a normal red alert. Kirk was eventually able to find the overloading phaser and proceeded to drop it in a waste chute in the corridor, likely murdering several unfortunate red shirts in lower decks. Later, in the episode That Which Survives, Kirk's phaser had its overload triggered while in his hand, forcing him to throw it away like a grenade. An overloading phaser even showed up in the Next Generation episode The Hunted, where a man named Roga Dinar tried to use them as bombs aboard the Enterprise D. Number 9. Phasers as survival tools. Starfleet hand phasers have many uses as survival tools. Of course, stranded officers could use them to hunt for food, but they could also be used to heat up rocks, as Wesley did in the episode Final Mission, to keep himself and Captain Picard warm, as well as several other examples. If the phaser was turned up to a higher setting, it could completely vaporize the rock, allowing officers to drill themselves out of a cave if the entrances collapsed. They could also be used in more unique survival situations. In Discovery's first episode, Captain Georgiou used a phaser to reopen a well, letting the water flow again. LaForge used one to melt silver ore into climbing equipment in the Next Generation episode The Enemy to get himself out of a pit. Aside from their use as tools, Starfleet hand phasers got their energy from small power cells, which could be used to power communications equipment and other machines. Number 8. Transporter phasers. In the final episode of Star Trek Picard: The Last Generation, Seven and Rafi's team came up with a new phaser modification. They were able to retake the bridge of the Titan A by connecting their phasers to the transporter systems. Anyone who was shot was sent to the transporter buffer. A standard gun setting probably wouldn't have worked well on these drones, so that was a great way to incapacitate their assimilated crew members without harming them. After retaking the bridge, Seven joked that they may have just invented the portable beam-me-up, but this actually wasn't the first time we've seen something like this in Star Trek. In the Next Generation episode Gambit, Picard was captured by mercenaries who shot him with a transporter-connected phaser to make it appear as though he was vaporized. The crew of the Enterprise all mourned his death before discovering that he was actually still alive. Number 7. Power levels. Hand phaser power levels range from a light zap, enough to clean graffiti off of ships' walls or cause slight skin irritation, all the way up to total vaporization. In between the two extremes, phasers could also burn targets, but more interestingly, the famous stun setting allows users to harmlessly incapacitate most species when in combat. A phaser would need to be modulated carefully to a very specific frequency depending on the mission's requirements. For example, in the DS9 episode Homefront, they found a frequency that was low enough to cause no permanent harm, but high enough to force a changeling to revert to their liquid form. Many may not know that starship phasers can actually be set to stun as well, allowing a ship to stun an entire city in one blast. However, we've only seen this in action once in the original series episode, A Piece of the Action. Number 6. The science of phasers. The exact way phasers work has only been explained on screen through sparse references to beam intensity, nadion particles, and other confusing technobabble. But the Star Trek Next Generation Technical Manual from 1991 went into a bit more detail. According to the reference book, the term phaser was short for phased energy rectification, and a phaser beam was generated by a complicated interaction between plasma and superconducted lithium copper that would cause a so-called rapid nadion effect, dissolving the strong nuclear force in the plasma. From there, a stream of energy would then be fired in pulses through a special superconducting crystal in the emitter. The intensity and frequency of these pulses would determine the effect of the blast, from heating to disintegration. All of this is consistent with what we've seen on screen, apart from the fact that phasers are generally referred to as particle beam weapons, which fire fictional rapid nadion particles, rather than a beam of electromagnetic energy. People have gone into a lot of work trying to describe the way phasers function, but the way they originated was much less scientific. In The Cage, the first Star Trek pilot featuring Captain Pike's crew, Starfleet used laser weapons. These were changed to phasers 2 days into filming the second pilot, and in the reference book The Making of Star Trek, released in 1968, Gene Roddenberry explained that the reason was that he knew people would be yelling "lasers can't do that" at their screens whenever the weapons were used for fantastical things like stunning people or vaporizing targets without damage to the surrounding area. By creating an entirely fictional technology, they were able to avoid scientific inaccuracies by just making it all up. Number 5. Ship phaser variants. In the Next Generation, we got to see a new evolution of the Starship phasers in the form of phaser strips. Phaser strips are long lines of large numbers of phaser emitters that run all across a ship's hull. Energy would travel along these lines and converge on the best possible spot for targeting. A Galaxy-class ship like the Enterprise D came equipped with 12 separate phaser strips, allowing them to fire in almost any direction. We don't know when exactly Starfleet switched from primarily using phaser banks like those on Kirk's Enterprise to phaser strips like in the Next Generation. But the earliest ship we've seen with phaser strips is the Ambassador-class Enterprise C from the year 2344, which we saw in the Next Generation episode Yesterday's Enterprise. Some ships, such as the Defiant, came equipped with pulse phaser cannons which rapidly fired concentrated bursts, as opposed to the steady beams of particles that shoot from standard phaser arrays. Number 4. Handheld phaser variants. Handheld Starfleet phasers can generally be classified into 3 main types. Type 1 phasers are the smallest variants resembling remote controls and are referred to as cricket phasers in the Trek community. Type 2 phasers, on the other hand, more closely resemble the design of a pistol, and Type 3s were more like rifles in appearance. Different phaser types have different power levels and firing modes, but all were capable of both stunning and disintegrating targets. In addition, all types could fire either a steady beam or concentrated blasts. The TV remote design of the Type 1s reinforces the idea that these devices are tools as well as weapons, and the Type 2s are apparently more combat-focused, explaining the gun-like look. In the original series era, Type 1 phasers could actually be slotted into Type 2s, for some reason. Type 3 rifles seem to be employed mostly in times of war. They showed heavy use both during the Dominion War and the Federation's engagements with the Borg. All 3 types of hand phasers have been redesigned countless times in Trek history, but they usually stick to these categories. A phaser bazooka also appeared in a holographic program in the Lower Decks episode Crisis Point, but these probably aren't a real thing, despite how cool they would be. Although there was that one shoulder cannon that Worf sported in Star Trek Insurrection. Number 3. The difference between phasers and disruptors. Phasers and disruptor weapons differ in several key ways. For starters, a phaser can be set to stun, whereas a disruptor is a purely lethal weapon. This difference was an easy way to show the contrast between the violence of alien empires like the Klingons and the comparatively humane Federation. Also, as mentioned earlier, phasers fire pulses of fictional particles called nadions, whereas disruptors seem to be much more blunt, simply disrupting the molecular bonds of their targets. And while both phasers and disruptors are capable of disintegration, disruptors often do so in a much slower and more painful way. However, Starfleet still used disruptors occasionally. In the original series episode Obsession, we learned that Type 2 Starfleet phasers actually have a mode called the Disruptor B setting, suggesting those specific weapons combined both phaser and disruptor tech. Number 2. Wide beams and phaser sweeps. Hand phasers are typically seen firing one narrow, highly accurate beam, but they could be configured for many more firing patterns. By adjusting the width and height of their spread, phasers could actually shoot wide beams or a cone-shaped phaser sweep. Wide beams, also called full spread, could be used to quickly take out a whole room of opponents. Phaser sweeps, however, were most effective when you needed to hit every single part of a room. Starfleet used phaser sweeps throughout DS9, in episodes like Homefront and The Adversary, to locate changeling infiltrators. As we mentioned earlier, these sweeps were set to a specific frequency that would cause any changelings disguised in the room to revert to a liquid. It's likely that these settings aren't typically used in large-scale firefights like the Siege of AR-558, simply because they consume way more power than a direct beam. Number 1. They're totally not guns. In Volume 2, Issue 12 of Star Trek the Magazine, Herman Zimmerman explained that Gene Roddenberry took issue with how some phasers looked similar to guns, specifically the rifles and the pistol grips of the Type 2 phasers. Presumably, he preferred the aesthetics of the Type 1 crickets. This all tracks with Gene's history of promoting non-violence in the franchise. However, logically, it's all a bit confusing, seeing as even Type 1 phasers were vastly more dangerous than even a modern military tank, despite looking like something you'd use to unlock your car. Of course, the stun setting allows Starfleet officers to non-violently resolve conflicts in a way that a gun never could, but in the wrong hands, they have the potential to cause unimaginable destruction. After all, a single misplaced phaser could disrupt the power balance of an entire pre-warp civilization.
You know them as that cool little thing what sits in your hand and you can check the internet and everything on the... No, I'm kidding. It's of course not your smartphone. It's the Tricorder. It's been around in Star Trek since 1966 and you might be a bit surprised to find out where the idea for the Tricorder originally came from. Thank you so much to the wonderful Jack Kiley for writing the original article upon which this is based. I'm Sean Ferrick for TrekCulture and here are 10 things you didn't know about Tricorders. Number 10. A brief history of the ones that occasionally explode. The world's most famous scanning device has a threefold name, but the story of its creation is twofold. The original impetus for the idea came from Gene Roddenberry as a way to expand the role of the yeoman. In a memo to Robert H. Justman from the 14th of April 1966, as cited in The Making of Star Trek, Roddenberry noted, "It has been suggested that she," meaning the captain's yeoman, "carry, as part of her regular equipment, some sort of neat over-the-shoulder recorder electronic camera. Haven't given much creative thought to what this would look like." Such thought went to Oscar-winning artist, designer, and sculptor Wah-Ming Chang. As brilliant as he was prolific, Chang had already designed the Talosian heads for the cage, and later created the M113 salt creatures, the Baylock effigy, the Gorn, the Tribbles, the Vulcan Lute, the Romulan bird of prey, the classic flip communicator, and built the phaser props based on Matt Jeffrey's design. For his Tricorder design and build, Chang charged Desilu Studios a mere $275 a piece. His initial sketch that can be found in Inside Star Trek: The Real Story is both elegantly simple and finely detailed, featuring the familiar screen, information discs, top pivot, and push buttons that make the device iconic with or without a certain tendency to explode. Number 9. Naming magic. According to the Starfleet Medical Reference Manual, Tricorders are, in practice, a small sensor computer recorder, or a tri-function recorder. The fact that the meaning of the name has never been discussed explicitly on screen gets the Star Trek Lower Decks treatment in the soon-to-be-released USS Cerritos Crew Handbook. As Ensign Rutherford states, "Good old Trikey, they call it a tricorder because it cords so many more than 3 things. In Star Trek Enterprise, they were just called hand scanners, of course, simpler times." What it does cord, as a matter of advanced future science fact, does just as well to be mostly indistinguishable from magic, a handy device to move the plot along. We're never actually shown the Tricorder operations manual. Occasionally, TV magic also clashes with in-world practicality technicalities, just how did Voyager get those tricorder upgrades in Season 2? If you believe Rick Sternbach, they had them in the cargo bay all along. The original series era tricorders weren't given a model number until perhaps most recently in Those Old Scientists, when Boimler suggested that TS-122 might be the model's true name, with the TS-120 being a predecessor. Trek's following century then gave us a whole new series of names for a brand new series of tricorders. Number 8. Next Gens. From Star Trek The Next Generation onwards, we've had the TR-566, the TR-587, the TR-590-10 and 11, the Admiral Janeway Future Erased ones, the relatively slimline ones, TR-890, 15, those Nemesis Palm Pilot ones, and the Purple Stripe ones, amongst other tricorders. The farthest far future of scanning is all about what you can cram into a tri-Combadge, and in Star Trek Insurrection, we also got the sneakiest of peeks at the wrist tricorder. Wearable tech? That'll never catch on. It is sadly not true that Martin Cooper's original mobile phone was inspired by Star Trek, but Motorola did give a knowing nod to the original series communicator when they named their first clamshell phone the StarTAC in 1996. Art imitated life, imitated art, when the 25th century tricorders got a very 21st century upgrade in Star Trek Picard's Season 2. They were Samsung Z flip phones in a case. A medical version with a detachable hand scanner was also seen in Picard's Season 3. All the flip tricorder designs in The Next Generation, Voyager and Deep Space Nine were the work of senior production illustrator and designer Rick Sternbach, who also co-designed Deep Space Nine, the Intrepid and Prometheus class, the Runabouts, and the Delta Flyer. Number 7. Uses, misuses, and abuses. There's a big red bit labelled Emerge, EMRG, on the TR-560, 580 and 590 tricorder modules. You might think that this was to send a distress call, but according to the Next Generation technical manual, it's actually the emergency dump everything to the ship button. Pressing it will send the tricorder's entire memory up to a range of 40,000 kilometers, disabling all scanning functions for about 0.875 seconds and draining half the power as well. Aside from ensuring Starfleet has all your data before you die, there are plenty of things you can do with a standard tricorder. Packed full of mechanical, electromagnetic and subspace sensors, all tricorders from the start of the Next Generation to at least Star Trek Nemesis had 3 input settings: Geo, for geological, Bio, biological, and Met, as in meteorological, for all your scanning needs. Tricorders can't detect neutrino emissions, however, so connect to a visor instead. The Star Trek Voyager technical manual gives a rather blunt description of how to use your tricorder. Simply point it at whatever it is you want to study. If you're after exact detail on how to use one to cause localized seismic disruptions or anesthetize a patient, then check out the Starfleet Survival Guide. Note that to really mess with the tricorder, you'll need a Thoron generator. Number 6. Medical tricorder. We have Beverly Crusher, or rather Gates McFadden, to thank in part for the gloriously detailed TNG-era tricorder technical information available to us. McFadden, a stickler for getting medical procedures accurate as possible, as they put it in the Star Trek The Next Generation technical manual, requested a set of consistent operating guidelines that were then devised by designer Rick Sternbach. From the manuals, we know that the Next Generation era medical tricorder is basically a standard tricorder with a specialized medical peripheral on top. This attachment adds 86 electromagnetic devices designed for medical use. The removable hand sensor has 15 high-resolution devices capable of active and passive scans of the entire body, internal organs, infectious microorganisms, and more. The TR-590 Tricorder X, introduced in Star Trek Deep Space Nine and Voyager, had the detachable hand scanner in the back. The original series medical tricorder was also a standard tricorder with benefits. According to the Starfleet Medical Reference Manual, the medical tricorder was outwardly similar to other modules, but came equipped with a diagnose, analyze, and record modes, as well as the remote scanner. Larger than its 24th century counterparts, the TOS medical tricorder had the handy advantage of a lower compartment with emergency surgical kit. Number 5. Klingons have Hokrame 2. So focused are we on our favourite Starfleet models, we often forget that other alien species in Trek have their own versions of the tricorder. Even the warrior race needs to scan things, all the better to batleth you in the end. The first time we saw a Klingon tricorder, Hokra, singular in the language, on screen was in Star Trek III: The Search for Spock, when Kruge whipped one out on the Genesis planet. The piece was designed by Industrial Light and Magic, who also created the Klingon Bird of Prey, Communicator, Daktag Knife, and the updated Starfleet tricorder tricorder for the film. The reference book, The Art of Star Trek, has the preliminary sketch of the Klingon tricorder with spring-loaded on mechanism as well as practical lights, and a note stating will have 1 or 2 lights in the back as well. The first Romulan tricorder to be named as such in dialogue appeared in Star Trek Generations and was designed by John Eves. Eves also designed the distinctly less hefty Jem'Hadar Dominion tricorder for the Star Trek Deep Space Nine episode Hippocratic Oath. His original concept art showing the tricorder with Velcro prop attachments for a Jem'Hadar forearm was auctioned for $200 by iCollector.com. Number 4. Toys and tape recorders. If you grew up in the 1970s, you probably had your eye on the Mego Corporation's first ever Star Trek action figures and accompanying Enterprise Bridge playset with spin-around transporter and a whole 2 stools. Did the Spock figurine talk to you in a dream? As well as getting your transporter in a twist, you might have spent 1976 begging your parents for the Mego Star Trek tricorder. Essentially a jazzed up tape recorder with a microphone, the Mego tricorder did have a flip-top lid and a relatively recognizable rotating moire display screen. It also came with a cassette that on one side played 30 minutes of audio from The Menagerie Parts 1 and 2, the other side was left blank, allowing children, overgrown or otherwise, to tape their own adventures, as a commercial from the time put it. Why was it blue? Dabba-dee-dabba-damned if I know. The design of toy replica tricorders has certainly improved over the years. The Playmates and Diamond Select varieties certainly look the part, and the technology is keeping up too. The Wand Company is set to release a functional original series style tricorder with actual sensors and sound recorder, a working display screen, and interchangeable data discs. Number 3. Whatever happened to the Psycho tricorder? This isn't the name of a bloodthirsty sentient tricorder that will stab you in the shower. It's an offshoot of the medical model that only ever featured in one episode of the original series, Wolf and the Fold. The Psycho tricorder, as seen in that episode, was also just a standard tricorder prop, capable of scanning and recording memories and of psychological examination more generally. The Psycho tricorder could be operated by a medical technician, although they might get killed by Jack the Ripper before they can get to the bottom of any hysterical amnesia. The Psycho tricorder has appeared in a smattering of beta canon works. In the original series Mud's Angels short story, The Business as Usual During Altercations, we even get a psychohistorian with a Psycho tricorder, but that's about it. It is possible that the functions of the Psycho tricorder were later incorporated into the standard medical tricorder, or made redundant by other techniques. In the Star Trek Voyager episode Night, the Doctor uses a medical tricorder to help diagnose Neelix's anxiety attacks as nilophobia, the fear of nothingness. Number 2. Raspberry Pi in the sky. Back in the day, you could transform your Palm Pilot or Pocket PC, remember those? I'm so old, into a rudimentary tricorder. Then there was, naturally, an app for that, although not without a few cease and desists from CBS. Taking full advantage of the miniaturized computer power of the Raspberry Pi, fans have also built their own impressive multifunctional models, neatly nicknamed Picorders. Chris Detective Zero Barrett, or Obso1337 on YouTube, is one such fan who took a Diamond Select TOS Science tricorder and turned it into much more. Barrett disassembled the toy, added in the Raspberry Pi, a display screen, battery, and a Sense Hat board, originally developed for use on the ISS, equipped with an accelerometer, magnetometer, gyroscope, barometer, and temperature and humidity sensors. Not only does Barrett's TOS Tricorder, TR108 in his naming system, look like the real thing, it works like one too, capable of recording sensor data from the environment and translating it on screen as close to the original series graphics as possible. And if that weren't extraordinary enough, his next project, the Picorder 2 TR109, was based on the next generation TR560-6 model with functional buttons, a display screen, lights, a thermal camera, and an environmental sensor package. This guy's awesome, and I would like to be his friend. Number 1. Take your sci-fi art, scan a broken heart. What medical professionals do today by employing an array of tests, techniques, and technologies has been pretty much scaled down to the one belt clippable or over-the-shoulder carryable in Star Trek. The vision of such diagnostic ease has inspired many to translate the on-screen dream of the medical tricorder into a real-life lifesaver. In 2012, the X Prize Foundation, a non-profit that does its best to promote a Gene Roddenberry-esque, equitable, and hopeful future of abundance for all, launched the Qualcomm Tricorder X Prize. Teams were challenged to create a tricorder-like device that could accurately diagnose 10 core medical conditions conditions such as atrial fibrillation, an abnormal heart rhythm, diabetes or stroke, and 3 elective conditions including hypertension, mononucleosis, glandular fever, and HIV. The device also had to be capable of monitoring 5 vital signs in real time. 5 years later, no participant had met all of the criteria for the $10 million grand prize, but the Trekly named Final Frontier Medical Devices won the first prize of $2.6 million for DXTER, an at-home medical instrument kit with AI diagnostic app. Voyager's EMH Robert Picardo even opened the awards ceremony with the required "Please state the nature of the medical emergency."
Starfleet Combadges were first introduced in the Next Generation as a more efficient and easily carried replacement for the communicators used before and during the original series films. Since then, however, they've become a staple of Star Trek. These devices have gone through a number of slight design changes over the years, but always feature the same iconic Starfleet insignia that was originally seen in TOS. Combadges are primarily known as communication devices, which is, of course, where the prefix com comes from, but they also have a variety of other uses that come up less often. In this list, we're going to take a look at a few of these abilities, as well as some general trivia about Combadges that few people actually notice. We're going to start off with details that are a bit more well known and gradually get more obscure as we go on. With all that being said, I'm Bree from TrekCulture, and if I sound sick, it's because I am. Slight head cold aside, here are 10 things that you didn't know about Combadges. Number 10. The Universal Translator. One of the most important devices inside the Combadge were the Universal Translators. These devices can scan brainwaves of most sentient aliens to translate their words into the user's native language in real time. The Universal Translators were invented shortly after the launch of the NX-01 Enterprise. They could be handheld or built into many ship systems, but incorporating them into Combadges made them much simpler to use, as the whole process was basically automated and available at any time. With a Universal Translator on them at all times, Starfleet officers were much more prepared in emergencies and while on away missions. Members of other species, such as the Ferengi, also kept Universal Translators on them at all times, but in the form of small devices inserted into their ears, as we saw in the Deep Space Nine episode Little Green Men. But the Combadge design seems much less invasive and easier to replace and repair. Number 9. Combadges as identification. Every Combadge has unique markers that could be used as personal identification. In the Next Generation episode Drumhead, we learned that the Enterprise's computers could actually tell who was using a console at any specific time by interfacing with their Combadge ID. Additionally, in the episode The Hunted, it's revealed that Combadges from this era also include a record of their assigned user's fingerprint data, which allows access to be restricted to them alone. This security feature prevents stolen identities and is very similar to fingerprint scanners on modern smartphones. It's also very likely that an officer's Combadge could be used as a more futuristic form of real-life military dog tags that were used to easily identify casualties. As most fans already know, Starfleet transporters can also lock onto specific people using unique markers on their Combadge. And to be honest, there's probably many other forms of ID included in them that we haven't even seen on camera yet. Number 8. Modifications into a distress beacon. Combadges transmit using subspace frequencies. This is the same technology that allows for faster-than-light communication between starships. Because of this, if Starfleet officers ever get lost or stranded alone, it's actually possible for them to modify their Combadges into a subspace distress beacon. The range of these beacons is very limited compared to dedicated subspace transmitters, but any ship passing by close enough to a planet would be able to detect a signal from the surface and conduct a rescue operation. This function has probably saved countless lives in Trek, as almost every officer stranded on an alien planet would still have their Combadge on them. We also know that an emergency distress signal would be activated from the badges if their outer casing was ever damaged. This is likely either to let the officer's ship know that they were in danger or to help crew locate fallen officers. Number 7. Their use as a transporter aid. As most fans know, Starfleet transporters are some of the most buggy devices in Star Trek. A passing ion storm, a thick atmosphere, and many other things can block the signal and make beaming much more difficult, if not impossible. One of the ways in which Starfleet counteracted this was by locking onto the Combadges rather than the people themselves. Apparently, Combadges give off a much stronger and more easily detectable signal that can cut through distortion. There have been a number of times in Trek when this technique was used. For example, when a bomb was planted on the Enterprise in the Next Generation episode The High Ground, Geordi attached his Combadge to it to help the transporter room beam it into space. It can be assumed that Combadges must have some sort of easily distinguishable rare materials materials inside of them, or some form of high-powered energy emitter that makes it easy to detect them even with huge amounts of interference. Number 6. Discovery's new Combadges. The crew of the Discovery were introduced to a lot of new technology after traveling to the 32nd century, including Combadges. This is an invention that replaced Starfleet Combadges at some point before their arrival in the future. In addition to a sleek new design and addition of rank markers, the Combadges also include several built-in devices to help with life in the final frontier. These devices were activated by hand gestures and tapping, and included a personal transporter interface, a tricorder, and a holographic pad to connect to the computer archive. In much the same way that the original Combadges removed the need for handheld communicators, Combadges cut down on the preparation needed for away missions and made life much more convenient in Starfleet by combining multiple devices into one. The Discovery crew took a while to get used to their upgrades, but soon embraced them along with all the other 32nd century technology that they acquired. Number 5. Non-Starfleet Combadges. Combadges have a reputation for being used by Starfleet, but there are actually a ton of other alien societies and private citizens that use similar devices. Most notably, the Klingon Empire and the Bajoran militia both had Combadges in the shape of their own insignias. The Klingons attached theirs to the side of one of their arms typically, and the Bajorans kept them on the left side of their chests, the side opposite of where Starfleet Combadges go. Additionally, Cristobal Rios from Star Trek Picard had his own personal Combadge with a custom emblem, which he provided to passengers aboard La Serena. There have also been dozens of other alien badges seen in Star Trek that could be Combadges or just simple insignias. It's unclear whether the Federation was the first organization to invent Combadges or whether some alien empire had come before them, but by the 24th century, the tech was commonplace pretty much all throughout the galaxy. Number 4. The origin of the design. The familiar shape of Starfleet's Combadges was canonically an evolution of the Starfleet logo that some officers used to wear as patches on their arms around the time of Star Trek Enterprise. Eventually, Starfleet dropped the background, leaving just the yellow pointer at the center, much like how modern real logos seem to simplify over time. The old United Earth logo itself seems to be an evolution of NASA's logo. It has the same circular shape, starry background, and pointer at the center, but slightly simplified was the removal of the white orbital shape and letters. NASA and other modern-day space organizations are about as close as we're gonna get to Starfleet right now, so it makes sense that certain design elements from them would make their way into the future. Also, in a great example of reality mirroring fiction, the United States recently revealed the logo for its new Space Force, which includes an arrowhead design much closer to the look of Combadges than NASA's logo. This design was probably taken from elements of the shield for the Air Force Space Command that was created in the 1980s, but it's unknown whether or not the original design was inspired by Trek or is merely a coincidence. Number 3. Section 31 Combadges. The Federation's secret organization, Section 31, often gets access to powerful new technology before Starfleet does. One example of this is Combadges. During the first 2 seasons of Star Trek Discovery, Starfleet officers are still using communicators. However, in the episode Saints of Imperfection, we saw Ash Tyler, now an agent for Section 31, tap his badge with his hand and speak into it to hail Leyland. Pike was just as surprised to see this as we are and asked Tyler, what the hell kind of communicator is that? The Section 31 Combadges of this era look exactly the same as the Starfleet badges, but with black coloring on one side. Some members of Starfleet recognized the black badges as a symbol of authority, but few knew their true meaning or that they doubled as communicators. So far, it's unknown why it was that Section 31 decided to keep Combadges a secret for so long. Number 2. The Altered Future Combadge. One particular Combadge design with 2 gold lines behind a silver outline of the Starfleet insignia appeared in a number of possible futures. We saw it in the Next Generation episode All Good Things, the Deep Space Nine episode The Visitor, and the Voyager episodes Timeless and Endgame. These possible futures never came to be, so neither did the badges. But Star Trek Picard gave us a new Combadge design that looked very similar. It too had the outline of the insignia in front of 2 lines, but this version was slightly different. For example, the top corners seemed to be shaved down and the left line was made larger than the right. It's very likely that these badges appeared slightly different from the ones we saw in possible futures because of the changes made to their timeline in the episodes that were mentioned earlier. Number 1. The earliest Starfleet Combadge we've seen. As mentioned in the intro, Combadges were first seen in the Next Generation. In the original series and the TOS films, the entire Federation, apart from agents of Section 31, used communicators instead, which were small phone-shaped devices. However, there's one scene that gives us a hint that they were introduced long before Picard's time. In the Next Generation episode episode Yesterday's Enterprise, there's a scene where we see Lieutenant Richard Castillo, a time-traveling visitor from the Enterprise C, tapping on his comm badge and talking into it. Lieutenant Castillo came from 22 years in the past, back when Starfleet still used the stylish red uniforms from the TOS films, which makes one wonder when exactly that change was made from the ordinary badges to the comm badges. This scene was probably just included because the team behind the episode simply forgot that the badges from the TOS films were never used as communicators. But the characters from that episode came from a point in time decades after the Enterprise B launched in Star Trek Generations, so comm badges being invented within this period fits into the timeline well enough for us to consider it canon.
Outside of warp drive, these magical creations are probably the most well-known piece of technology to come out of this franchise, and also to make us all really upset whenever we have to queue for a plane, or a bus, or a car, or pay for petrol. With that in mind, I'm Sean Ferrick for TrekCulture, and here are 10 things you need to know about transporters. Number 10. They were invented to save money and time. The earliest pitches for Star Trek had to deal with the challenge of getting the crew down to the planets each week. Support shuttles were suggested, as was landing the Enterprise itself, though both would have proven prohibitively expensive in the beginning. So the producers were backed against a wall and came up with the idea of the matter transporter. This became part of the pitch, and part of the reason that Star Trek was given the green light, twice. It helped to sell the cage, first of all. Now, rather than committing to large-scale models for the pilot that may or may not take off, spoiler, it didn't, this fantastic new technology could be used instead. When the cage failed to make any traction, the show was given a new pilot where no man has gone before, though it was actually the man trap that helped Star Trek survive. The depiction of the transporter in that episode excited the network so much that they bumped it up for broadcast, meaning that it was shown to audiences before the first episode. Number 9. The first transporter was achieved with practical effects. The actual look of the transporter beam is quite striking in its various iterations and is most often achieved by means of CGI. Star Trek Voyager and Star Trek Discovery heavily redesigned the original transporter beam, adding a slower blue dissolve in the former with a golden circular pattern appearing in the latter. The original series achieved the look by dropping aluminium powder between the camera and a black background. This was then superimposed on the images of the various crewmen who were then dissolved out of the shot. This was most often achieved with the actual footage being frozen, as it would be a little later in the franchise before technology would allow people to move while in transport. Between that wall and the brightly lit floor and ceiling pads, the transporter set was able to overpower the stage lights, allowing an easier transition for overlaying the shots of the beam itself. Number 8. The Heisenberg compensator. The Heisenberg compensator is part of the transporter that specifically deals with Werner Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. In quantum mechanics, the principle is any of a variety of mathematical inequalities that place a limit on the accuracy that certain pairs of physical quantities of a particle can accurately predict. So, what does this mean in English? First published in 1927, German physicist Heisenberg posited that the more precisely an object's location can be determined, the less likely it is to predict its momentum after initial findings. This theory was then put into the makeup of the transporter in Star Trek. In the episode Realm of Fear, Barclay and O'Brien are seen examining the Heisenberg compensator, which is shown to be a component of the overall device. This is their workaround for Heisenberg's theory. Now, it goes without saying that the compensator is an entirely fictional invention, while the transporter itself does have a basis in reality. More on that later. The compensator also became a handy plot point, something that the crew would look to when there was an issue with a transport that was either out of their control, or an easy scapegoat when trying to stall the Moriarty hologram in Ship in a Bottle. Number 7. Transporters can be used as weapons. The transporter has a very dark capacity while remaining the easiest method of travel in Star Trek's universe. Once an area is unshielded, it can serve to pluck any living thing from its location and beam them wherever the operator chooses. For example, there are several occasions in the original series when some poor redshirts stepped onto the transporter pad only to find themselves floating in space moments later. The transporter can be co-opted as well. In the darkness and the light, while Dax and Worf are attempting to beam a member of Kira's old resistance cell to their runabout, the transporter pattern is scrambled. This is deliberate. The deranged Cardassian Siloran Prin had been systematically wiping out the Shakar cell. He hit a tiny pattern scrambler on the poor victim, which ended up killing her in a horrible fashion, all while Dax and Worf looked on, unable to stop it. More recently, 7 of 9 used the transporters aboard La Sirena to beam several Neo-Borg drones into the foundations of Chateau Picard, killing them instantly as they rematerialized with half of their bodies fused to the stone. Number 6. Emergency transporters. The first obvious use of the emergency transporter came in Star Trek Nemesis. This was used by Data to rescue Captain Picard, though at the cost of his own life. It was a small device, fitted with its own power source, giving it the ability to send a signal back to the Enterprise E without having to rely on either that ship or the Scimitar's power sources. By that year, it was still considered a prototype due to its limitations. Earlier incarnations of emergency transporters were closer in design to those standard personnel transporters found aboard most starships and starbases. These were designed to send larger groups at a time, often used during evacuation procedures. By the 32nd century, these smaller transporters had become standard practice, embedded into Starfleet Combadges. Starfleet Discovery's 3rd and 4th seasons seem to have done away with the standard transporter rooms altogether, as the Combadge contains enough power to send the wearer from ship to planet, whereas this was beyond the capabilities of earlier models. A combination of the personal transporters and the pattern buffers allowed the crew of the Discovery to escape disintegration as the ship exited a void as part of their search for the cause of the DMA. Number 5. No, "Beam me up, Scotty" was never said out loud. Though now it's well known, the exact phrase "beam me up, Scotty" was never actually said on screen in Star Trek. Many variations of the command were issued throughout the years, including near misses like "Scotty, beam me up." The misquote started to appear in popular media roughly 10 years after Star Trek's debut. It was both connected to the franchise itself and became slang that was used in other contexts. Perhaps unsurprisingly for the period, i.e. the 60s and 70s, it quickly became associated with taking mind-altering drugs, allowing the user to disappear into another place, mentally. James Doohan used the phrase as the title of his autobiography in 1996, and the quote was so connected to him that it's included in his obituary despite the actor never having spoken the lines, nor responded to them. William Shatner did, however, include the line in an audio recording of his novel Ashes to Eden. The rebooted Kelvin films have continued the tradition of almost using the quote, as there are several examples where Kirk and other characters quickly bark the order, "Scotty, beam us out." Number 4. Transwarp beaming. Transwarp beaming was demonstrated in the Kelvin Timeline films to a mixed reaction. In the film, it's Montgomery Scott who perfected the theory, though in the time that Spock Prime travels back to, Scotty has yet to master it, much to the chagrin of Admiral Archer and his prize Beagle. Spock shows him the theory required, however, this has a knock-on effect. In Star Trek Into Darkness, rogue Section 31 agent John Harrison, definitely not Khan, uses it to escape Earth and travel all the way to Kronos. Though the film depicts this as a single beam, the novelization states the device used didn't have enough power, requiring Khan to beam to a ship, then use that ship to beam to the Klingon homeworld. Though this miracle device would seem to make Starfleet obsolete, it had actually been suggested by Gene Roddenberry in the initial development of Star Trek The Next Generation. He put it forward as another cost-saving method, removing the need for a starship at all. Thankfully, writer David Gerrold shot that idea down straight away. The Enterprise is the hero, he said, delaying this technology for about a further 20 years. Number 3. Does the transporter send the atoms and the bits, or just the bits? The canon definition of the transporter states that it sends both the atoms of the person or item along with the information around said atoms. To put it another way, the transporter is said to send the original file in whole instead of a copy. Now, with that being the case, there's a number of issues in how this is depicted in the franchise. In the episode The Enemy Within, Captain Kirk is split into two halves. There is the passive good Kirk and the highly aggressive evil Kirk. Though a fun story, written by Richard Matheson no less, if one is to follow the canon explanation of the transporter, this would be impossible. Theoretical physicist Lawrence Krauss wrote in his book The Physics of Star Trek that if the atoms and the information are being sent in a transporter beam, then splitting into two distinct people would be impossible, as the beam could only rematerialize the exact same number of atoms. To split Kirk in this fashion, the poor man would have to be bifurcated. However, if the transporter only sends the information each time, then transporter clones are entirely possible. This would account for Evil Kirk, Thomas Riker, and William Boimler, all of whom were created as transporter copies along the way. Number 2. God bless the pattern buffer. The pattern buffer is the part of the transporter that stores the information due to be sent from one location to the next. This, combined with the Doppler compensators, allowed the device to factor in any changes during transport that may have occurred after hitting send. With that said, there were many more uses for the component beyond its initial design. The most well-known jury-rigging of a pattern buffer came when the Enterprise D discovered the downed USS Jenolan on the Dyson Sphere. With that ship all but destroyed, Captain Montgomery Scott and another crewman, Matt Franklin, programmed the pattern buffers to lock into a continuous diagnostic cycle, effectively keeping them in stasis. The theory was only half successful. Scotty rematerialized, but Franklin went the way of the redshirts. The pattern buffers also stored all information from each transport, which in turn allowed them to keep something of medical history for travelers. In Favorite Son, the crew of Voyager were able to determine the truth behind Harry Kim's supposed return home, as alien DNA is traced back through his trips in the transporter. The buffers could be extended to carry several dozen travelers at a time, though this was rarely advised, as too much information could cause them to malfunction. Number 1. Teleportation in reality. The idea that led to the transporter, namely teleportation itself, is a far older phenomenon than Star Trek. The first usage of the term was coined by American writer Charles Fort in his 1931 novel, Low. Though in the novel he prefaces by saying that many will accuse him of making up nonsense, he proceeds to at least attempt to define it. The term comes from the Latin words for remote, tele, and to carry, portare. Fort was using the term to describe the strange disappearances and appearances of anomalies. A similar idea had existed in fiction for a while, with examples as early as 1897 combining both teleportation and time travel, though at that time the word had not yet been coined. Quantum teleportation suggests that it is possible to transmit the information of a subject across distances without actually moving them. This would tie in with Lawrence Krauss's theory that it would allow for transporter clones. Now, while there's no conclusive verifications of this type of transport to date, in 2014, researcher Ronald Hansen and colleagues from the Technological University Delft in the Netherlands demonstrated information teleportation between two entangled quantum bits that were 3 meters apart. Now, the aviation and motor industries can relax, as this may not be a precursor to matter transportation just yet, but it is certainly a rung on that same ladder.
Geordi LaForge from Star Trek The Next Generation was born without eyesight, but thanks to Starfleet medical science, he was able to see even better than those with normal human vision using his signature Visor, which stood for Visual Instrument and Sensory Organ Replacement. Geordi received his first Visor shortly after turning 5. It basically gave him superhuman abilities, as he could see things that would be invisible for others, but the device wasn't without its issues. Throughout his Starfleet career, it caused Geordi a fair amount of trouble and made the job a lot harder for LeVar Burton, who had to play the character with his eyes almost completely covered. The Visor has also become greatly iconic in pop culture and has inspired a lot of real-world creations. But there are plenty of facts about Geordi's Visor that fans may have missed or forgotten over the years. Remember, the Visor was so much more than just a fashion statement. So with that in mind then, I'm Ellie with TrekCulture here with 10 things you didn't know about Geordi's Visor. Number 10. What Geordi can see. The colours that humans see are actually just different wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation, with red being the longest and violet the shortest. However, visual light is only a small segment of the electromagnetic spectrum. Longer wavelengths contain types of radiation like infrared light, microwaves and radio waves, and shorter wavelengths contain types like ultraviolet light, X-rays and gamma rays. With his Visor, Geordi was able to see much more of the electromagnetic spectrum, meaning he could detect heat by looking at infrared light and sometimes see through objects or clouds that would appear opaque for anyone else. He also saw the world in much more detail than the average person. He could detect tiny details in people's heart rates and perspiration, which sometimes even allowed him to tell if someone was lying. There have been several scenes that have given us representations of Geordi's way of seeing, but with ordinary human eyes, it's actually physically impossible to even comprehend what it would be like to see anything other than visible light. Number 9. How it affected LeVar Burton's acting. In an interview with the Television Academy Foundation, LeVar Burton discussed the difficulty of playing a character who was supposed to have such enhanced vision, while in reality he had about 85% of his view completely blocked off by the visor. Apparently at the beginning of The Next Generation, Burton was constantly knocking into things, able only to see what was directly in front of him. Over time, he got better by learning new ways to navigate the sets with the visor on, like using light stands and other points of reference that stood out. Burton was nearly completely blinded during filming, which made his job a lot harder. Beyond that, with a large part of his face covered, Burton also had to try way harder to convey emotion with just his mouth and body language. Despite all of these limitations though, Burton was able to pull the whole thing off brilliantly for 7 whole seasons before Geordi finally got his upgrade after Star Trek Generations. Number 8. Why Geordi stopped using his visor. We first saw Geordi's ocular implants in the Next Generation finale, All Good Things. After the timeline was changed in that episode, he ended up getting this new tech shortly after Star Trek Generations, but they were actually invented far earlier. In the episode Loud as a Whisper, Dr. Pulaski revealed that she had actually done several surgeries to install these kinds of implants and offered to replace Geordi's visor with them. Geordi decided not to go through with the procedure because he believed that the technology of ocular implants was not yet on the same level as the visor. He would have basically been sacrificing visual range for a bit of added comfort and a more natural look. But apparently, by the time of first contact, either those devices had advanced far enough or Geordi simply decided that aesthetics and comfort were more important to him, though the ocular implants still did cause him headaches from time to time. Of course, LeVar Burton often argued to have his visor replaced with something more natural, but it wasn't until after The Next Generation ended that he finally got what he wanted. Number 7. Why Geordi declined treatment. Geordi's visor actually caused him a lot of discomfort. He would often get headaches and become overwhelmed by all of the information his brain was receiving. The data from the sensors was transmitted into the brain through short pulses, rather than all at once, which made it a bit easier to process, but he still experienced constant pain in his day-to-day life. In Encounter at Farpoint, Dr. Crusher offered to either give him painkillers or a surgery to numb the affected parts of his brain, but he declined both options because he believed that they would cause the visor to be less effective. Keeping the visor at peak performance was really important to Geordi. He used his advanced sight in his engineering work constantly. Hopefully, Geordi will have found an effective way to treat these symptoms when we see him in the 3rd season of Star Trek Picard, though. Number 6. Other visors in Star Trek. Geordi wasn't the only character in Star Trek history with a visor, nor was he actually the first. In fact, in the Discovery episode Brothers, we saw a Starfleet officer from about 100 years before The Next Generation wearing an earlier model of the same device. This retro visor looked much bulkier and wrapped around the entire head instead of just the eyes, probably to more easily reach different parts of the brain. We also saw 2 officers with visors in the Lower Decks episode Second Contact. The first could be seen when Tendi went aboard the shuttlecraft on the Cerritos, and the second appeared as a member of the landing party visiting the Galadonians. Later, we got a visor-wearing teddy bear in the episode Cupid's Errant Arrow as well. Ocular implants were probably a more common technology than visors because they worked as well as normal eyes and felt far more natural, but for those who wanted a bit of an upgrade, a visor was the way to go. Number 5. Rihanna's visor. In 2016, Rihanna developed a new line of sunglasses in collaboration with Dior, which the pop star said were directly inspired by Geordi's unique style. "I've always been obsessed with his eyewear," Rihanna said while explaining her design process. She continued, "And when I got to Dior and saw all the materials I could play with, it all just came together." It didn't take long for Rihanna's drawings to be translated into a physical prototype, and the line was released later that year in June. While her sunglasses are definitely more fashion-focused than Geordi's visor, you can kind of see the similarities if you really squint. The connected lenses are really the best giveaway. Rihanna's always been a big Star Trek fan, something she's mentioned in the past. She even made a song and music video called Sledgehammer to promote Star Trek Beyond. It's actually really nice to see her get the opportunities to just nerd out about Star Trek to her fans. Number 4. Geordi almost gave the visor up for love. We first saw Ensign Sonia Gomez in the Next Generation episode Q Who, when she accidentally spilled her drink on Captain Picard. She later appeared in the episode Samaritan Snare, then years later in the Lower Decks episode First Contact as a captain. However, her role in the show was originally planned to be much bigger. The writers had plans to make Gomez into a new love interest for LaForge. They wanted a reason to have Geordi undergo a dangerous surgery to replace his visor with something more natural, so the idea was that the two would start to get closer, eventually leading to a romance, and Geordi would decide to go through with the surgery in order to see her beauty through human eyes. The writers soon decided that Geordi and Sonia were not meant to be, likely because they gave the actors no indication that the characters were supposed to be into each other, and so Geordi never had a reason to risk his life to see naturally. Number 3. Visor live video feeds. Visors could actually be linked to a computer, which could generate a live video feed of the device's point of view onto a screen. Now, this may seem like a cool ability to have for the Enterprise crew, but it was actually a major security issue. In Star Trek Generations and the episode The Mind's Eye, which we'll talk about again in a moment, Geordi was captured and unknowingly had his visor linked to his captor's computers. This allowed the Klingons to learn the Enterprise's shield modulation in Generations and helped the Romulans monitor Geordi in The Mind's Eye. Some fans even theorized theorized that these two events are actually what inspired Geordi to switch to ocular implants after generations, as they had no external interfaces which could be used to hack them like the Visor. Having someone else spy on him through his own eyes on 2 occasions has got to be pretty traumatic. Number 2. The mind control powers of the Visor. Geordi LaForge was captured by Romulans while on vacation in the episode The Mind's Eye. Using the Visor's interface with Geordi's brain, they were able to force him to see horrible images and eventually conditioned his mind to follow their orders. Using this mind control method, the Romulans hoped to get Geordi to assassinate a Klingon named Varg in order to spark conflict between the Klingon Empire and the Federation, which they nearly succeeded at. Luckily, Data began detecting strange E-band emissions aboard the ship and was able to figure out that they were being used to interface with the Visor. It was later discovered that Kel, one of the Klingons visiting the Enterprise, was actually a Romulan conspirator who was feeding Geordi commands through E-bands. It's truly terrifying to know that the same technology that allowed Geordi to see could also be used to command his brain. Number 1. Real-life visors. We don't have anything as advanced as Geordi's visor in the present, but we're getting closer every day. We already have devices that can see far further than us and detect parts of the electromagnetic spectrum that we can't see with our eyes. Add that with the fact that technology that interfaces with your brain has been getting way more advanced recently, and it seems like it may not be that long before technology becomes real. Funnily enough, there actually was a real vision aiding device released in the late 90s that was called Geordi, for Joint Optical Reflective Display, in honor of Geordi LaForge. The Geordi device was based on NASA tech and used cameras to allow people with limited vision to see further. It even had a zoom function, but it wasn't directly linked into the brain and only worked if the person had some level of sight in their eyes. But still, it's interesting to see Star Trek inspiring real-life innovation, even if it may be a while before we can see anything like the Visor.
Travel in the Star Trek universe is more dangerous and interesting than you know. With that in mind, I'm Sean Ferrick for TrekCulture, and here are 10 things you need to know about warp drive. Number 10. Humans were very late to the game. Everybody knows that humanity achieved their first independent warp flight on April 5th, 2063. On this day, Zefram Cochrane piloted the Phoenix, the ship that he created from the shell of a nuclear missile, breaking the light speed barrier for the first time. This attracted attention, widening humanity's view of the universe. The Vulcan survey ship Toplana Hath was passing through the Sol system and was alerted to the flight. They made first contact with Earth, beginning the process that would eventually lead to the formation of the Federation. For the Vulcans, however, this achievement came almost 3 millennia after they had broken the light speed barrier themselves. It was roughly the 9th century BC Earth reckoning when the Vulcans achieved warp drive. However, according to Ronald D. Moore, Cochrane is still credited as inventing warp drive as it is understood in the Star Trek universe. This could mean that the Vulcans had been using a less sophisticated form of propulsion, similar to the Romulan method of forced quantum singularities, that was then abandoned after meeting with Cochrane in the 21st century. Number 9. The Phoenix wasn't always humanity's first warp ship. Although accepted canon now has the Phoenix as the first human warp-capable ship, this wasn't always the case. Star Trek Deep Space Nine had a model of the Bonaventure C221 in Keiko O'Brien's schoolroom, appearing in 2 episodes. It was a cylindrical vessel shown once in a diagram and a second time as a physical model. According to its designer Doug Drexler, it was a forerunner to the Bonaventure NCC 10281 that had previously appeared in the animated series episode The Time Trap. In fact, the Bonaventure was the name of the first warp ship long before the Phoenix was ever conceived. In the novel Federation by Judith and Garfield Rees-Stevens, Zefram Cochrane travelled to Alpha Centauri aboard the Bonaventure, with his later personal vessel being named the Bonaventure 2. At the time of release in 1994, this still remained in canon with the TV series, as Star Trek First Contact was not released until 1996. Number 8. Don't mess with the antimatter containment pods. Warp drive, at least aboard a Federation starship, was achieved by the controlled release of matter and antimatter via the warp core. However, if the 2 substances were ever to meet, they would destroy each other, releasing a wave of pure energy, most often referred to as a warp core breach. A breach invariably resulted in the destruction of whatever ship it occurred on. The USS Yamato fell victim to an Iconian probe that drained power from the antimatter containment pods. Once energy levels fell below 15%, they failed, resulting in the antimatter escaping containment and destroying the ship. The Enterprise D almost succumbed to the same fate, though Captain Picard and Commander Data were able to prevent it in time. They only bought the ship a few years though. Battle with a Klingon bird of prey commanded by the Duras sisters resulted in catastrophic damage to the antimatter containment units and the coolant systems. Though the crew managed to escape to the saucer section, which separated, the drive section was consumed by the breach, with the resulting shockwave crashing the saucer into the surface of Iridian 3. Number 7. Antimatter does a lot more than make ships go. Warp drive is powered by antimatter and matter. However, antimatter is far more durable than simply serving as one half of futuristic diesel. In fact, it has been shown to have a strange relationship with standard space-time. In the original series episode The Naked Time, the ship is able to travel backward through time using controlled implosions of antimatter. While this, of course, is a very handy trick for getting out of a tight spot, it is rarely referred to again. The Enterprise does travel through time via warp drive several more times, though without using this method. In the Next Generation episode, We'll Always Have Power, antimatter served in the opposite role. Data had to use antimatter to realign one of Dr. Paul Mannheim's experiments, as it had begun to deteriorate, resulting in disruptions in space-time. Here, antimatter actually set the flow of time to rights again. It has other uses outside of propulsion as well, including being a component of photon torpedoes. Had the Enterprise B been carrying a complement of photons during its maiden voyage, they would have been able to detonate an antimatter explosion near enough to the SS LaCool and SS Robert Fox, freeing them from the Nexus. However, the torpedoes didn't arrive till Tuesday. Number 6. Those ample nacelles. Most vessels stick to a standard 2 nacelle design. These nacelles, taking their name from the similar propulsion components on air and watercraft, created a subspace distortion field around the ship, allowing vessels to ride through the distortion at extreme velocities. They were usually separated from the rest of the ship by large pylons, an idea stemming from Matt Jeffries, the designer of the original Enterprise. He felt that, when in use, the nacelles would be flooded with dangerous levels of radiation and that no crew member should be near them. This rule was relaxed by the 7th season of The Next Generation, as a control room was built into them. Later ships like the Defiant and Steamrunner class had the nacelles built directly into the main hull. These nacelles were still a weak point on their ships. Damage could be catastrophic, such as an alternate timeline that saw the Enterprise D explode following a collision with the USS Bozeman. By the 31st century, Starfleet had begun to design ships with detached nacelles. While this was said to make warp drive in these vessels more reliable, it also served to protect the ships from direct damage due to impact with the nacelles. Several ships, including the Freedom class, Hermes class, Saladin class, and, in the alternate timeline, Kelvin class, were also able to operate with only one warp nacelle. Number 5. One crystal to rule them all. Dilithium crystals were the main source of powering the warp cores of Starfleet ships, along with many other races in the galaxy. The Klingons, Cardassians, and the Breen all sought these rare minerals for their propulsion systems, and much like the fossil fuel crisis that Earth faces today, these were a finite resource, leading to raiding parties and trouble between powers. By the 2250s, Starfleet was already aware of the dwindling supplies, though it would not become acutely critical until the 31st century. Experiments in spore drive technology were initiated in the hope of replacing the crystals, though they were deemed a failure. Another issue facing them was that through a process known as decrystallization, they would effectively run out of power. Spock and Scotty managed to devise a way to recharge them during a temporal mission in 2286, which was then implemented through the rest of the fleet by the 24th century. The discovery of a planet made of dilithium in the Verubian Nebula may have served to help Starfleet get back on its feet by the 32nd century, though many more experiments in alternative forms of travel were badly needed to replace this already dwindling supply. Number 4. Warp 10 in the original series. At the time of the Enterprise's famous 5-year mission, the galaxy operated on a different warp scale to that which was used in the Next Generation onward. For example, it was possible for ships to travel in excess of warp 10 without occupying every point in the universe instantaneously, though it was still considered an unsafe velocity. The Orions routinely traveled at these speeds as, according to Spock at least, they were unconcerned with safety. Modifications to the Enterprise allowed it to travel in excess of the speed as well, including the changes made by the Nomad probe and by the Kelvins. Perhaps the greatest sustained velocity observed by the Enterprise at this time was that of Carla 5 in the counterclock incident. Thanks to the extreme time dilation effects of a black hole and her own natural reversed universe, her vessel was recorded traveling at warp 36, a speed that was theoretically impossible at the time. Generally, starships kept their speed below the warp 10 barriers for the safety of ship and crew, though they were, at that time, capable of breaking this speed limit. Number 3. Salamander speed. In the 24th century, the Warp 10 barrier was redesignated to become infinite velocity, which meant that in theory, no ship should be able to break this barrier. This was tested on a number of occasions. First, the Enterprise D traveled at speeds that neared Warp 10 when both the Traveler and Kaczynski came aboard the ship. The Traveler's modifications allowed the ship to reach Galaxy M33. Commander Riker and Captain Picard theorized that breaking the Warp 10 barrier would allow a ship to travel back in time, which, according to them, was how the shuttlecraft El-Baz had managed such a feat the following year. The most significant experiment on reaching Warp 10 occurred in the Delta Quadrant. Thanks to the discovery of an extremely rare form of dilithium, Torres and Paris were able to fit the shuttlecraft Cochrane with a Warp 10 coil. The experiment was a success with a sting in the tail. While Paris did break the barrier, he then underwent a hyper-evolution, which saw him evolve into a giant salamander. Before reaching his final form, he kidnapped Captain Janeway, taking her on a Warp 10 flight. The experiment was deemed too risky to repeat, even though both officers were returned to their normal forms. Number 2. The Great Experiment. In the 2280s, Starfleet had begun a series of experiments that began with the USS Excelsior NX-2000. This ship, said to have transwarp capabilities, was captained by Styles, a deeply arrogant commander who stepped over Sulu for promotion. He received a nasty shock when the Excelsior suffered a total system shutdown after Scotty sabotaged their propulsion systems. Though little was said of the transwarp experiment again, it was said that these trials were deemed a failure. The Excelsior was retrofitted with a conventional warp drive, entering service later that decade. Starfleet would not manage to achieve transwarp until the 2370s. However, perhaps failure is too strong a word, as the discoveries made while testing the Excelsior led directly to the upgrading of their engines and the advanced propulsion systems on board the Ambassador-class ships. Both classes of vessels remained in service well into the 24th century, thanks primarily to their durability in action. In fact, both were seen as strong enough to bear the name Enterprise. A refit of the Excelsior class became the Enterprise B, while an Ambassador-class ship became the Enterprise C. Number 1. Transwarp, Slipstream, and beyond. There are, of course, other forms of transport in the Star Trek universe. The Borg have managed to successfully achieve transwarp capability, which allows them to suddenly appear at the drop of a hat. Their system of transwarp corridors, linked by hubs dotted throughout the galaxy, has greatly contributed to their terrifying reputation. They primarily use transwarp coils and a chronoton field to achieve these speeds, as the gravimetric shear that a cube creates could, in theory, tear it to pieces. While Federation ships can use transwarp coils, finding them was extremely difficult, as the Borg were not known for their generosity. An alternative appeared in the form of a quantum slipstream drive aboard the USS Dauntless, though this too turned out to be too dangerous. This was supplied by an alien named Arturus, and he was hell-bent on delivering Voyager to the Borg. Slipstream drive relied on Benamite crystals as opposed to dilithium. These were even rarer to find, though a small supply was secured the year after first discovering the Dauntless. While Voyager was only able to shave 10 years off their journey this way, by the 32nd century, it was a standard system aboard ships such as Books.
I'm Carl. One of the best intro lines in quite a while in Star Trek. We are going to go through one of the most fascinating devices or beings that was introduced in the original series and we saw again in Star Trek Discovery. I'm Sean Farrick for TrekCulture, and here are 10 things you didn't know about the Guardian of Forever. Number 10. It seems to enjoy testing people. We see in the episodes Terra Firma of Star Trek Discovery that Carl, or the Guardian, puts Emperor Giorgio through quite a rigorous test to see if she's, quite frankly, worthy enough of being saved. If we go back to the original series episode, The City on the Edge of Forever, in which the Guardian of Forever was introduced, you see McCoy, Kirk, and Spock travel through time, and although McCoy alters the future, Kirk and Spock put it to rights. When they return home, the Guardian says, "I am the gateway, many such journeys can be made," as though inviting them to do this again. Kirk's grief at the loss of Edith Keeler is still too near, and so they book it out of there. Somewhere in that millennium between, it seems that the Guardian's criteria for use has changed, and that is probably to do with the temporal wars. By the time we get to Burnham and Giorgio arriving at the Guardian, the test seems to have changed. Not now to see if, someone can be trusted to fix a mistake, but if someone can be trusted to do good. Giorgio saves the life of Saru in the Mirror Universe, and Carl sends her back to a time when it will be safe to exist. Number 9. It's both sentient and alive, while also being neither. In The City on the Edge of Forever,
when Kirk and Spock meet the Guardian on the planet, they ask, "Are you alive? Are you a machine?" And effectively the Guardian responds, "Yes and no." They comment on the fact that this is slightly confusing, to which the Guardian responds, and I love this line, basically, "I'm putting it as simply as your little minds can understand." That type of wit was something that you would see return years later with Carl. And there is a, if you like, a sort of a biting satire in the way that he interacts with Georgiou and Burnham, in the way that maybe it wasn't as obvious back with Kirk and Spock, but it was still there. In a way, I feel like this might be a holdover from the original draft of the script, when it was both a machine and simply a tool. Number 8, Harlan Ellison. Going behind the scenes now, Harlan Ellison was commissioned to write the original screenplay for The City on the Edge of Forever. The version that he turned in, which I'll go into in a bit more detail in a few minutes, was deemed by both Roddenberry and the production staff to be not what they were looking for. It was a bit too dark, it was a bit too adult, and it was a bit too out there. So, as often happens with scripts in the production process, it underwent a series of rewrites. Now, what they didn't do was consult Ellison. When Ellison saw what had been done with his script, he was not happy. He felt that it had been eviscerated, and even though the episode would go on to win the 1967 Hugo Award, which is a big deal, he effectively wanted his name off it. It would take quite a few years, in fact it was 1993, when a bound version of the original script with a large essay written by Ellison was published and released to the public. This didn't really hold anything back, and it detailed the fact that this feud that existed between Harlan Ellison and the makers of the episode outlived many of the people involved in the story. Years later, again, IDW Publishing ran a comic series in 2014 which does Ellison's original script in comic form. Number 7, it has the power to cross universes as well as time. There was nothing in the past that specifically contradicts this, it just hadn't been explored. So if we look at it this way, it meant that the Guardian of Forever in The City on the Edge of Forever and later in Yesteryear would have had the power for these people to visit the mirror universe. This poses an interesting question, which is there an equivalent on the other side? If so, why haven't we seen anyone else come over with it? There's maybe an obvious answer for that, is that if you move too forward in time when you're crossing universes, you start to undergo a pretty painful death, which is what Georgiou was going through before Carl saves her. But I think most importantly, what this does is it opens the door to hop between universes. Now, while the mirror universe has been done to death at this stage, Kelvin universe hasn't. Number 6, the Guardians of the Time Vortex. The original script by Harlan Ellison ran something like this. A crewman on board the Enterprise, Beckwith, was dealing drugs to the Enterprise crew, and he was discovered by another crewman called Lebec. However, Beckwith murdered Lebec and escaped down to the surface of the planet. He was pursued by Kirk and Spock, although, much like McCoy did, he hops through the Guardian of Forever and prevents the death of Edith Kostler. Beckwith escapes down to the planet. There, he meets the 9 feet tall Time Vortex Guardians. So the Guardians in this instance, they were a race of aliens who were tasked with controlling this time vortex. Now they agree to send him through, but they also agree to send Kirk and Spock through. Then the episode plays out relatively similarly. Beckwith prevents the death of Edith Kostler, and then Kirk, crucially at the very end, fails to stop him, so Spock has to step in and ensure Edith's death. They come back to the future, and later there's this incredible line that when Kirk is grieving in his quarters, Spock says, No other woman was promised the universe for love. I mean, that's a hell of a line. Try following that one. For several reasons, this script was deemed too expensive, and particularly the Guardians of the Time Vortex, these 9-foot tall aliens, it was just way outside the budget that was available to the episode at the time. Number 5. You've heard its voice before. In Terra Firma, we get Paul Guilfoyle playing the human version of Carl, and in Yesteryear, the animated series episode, it was voiced by James Toohan. It was probably one of the 47 voices he was doing in that episode that week. But in The City on the Edge of Forever and via archive recording in Terra Firma, Bart LaRue was the voice of the Guardian of Forever. Bart LaRue had such a distinctive baritone voice that he was often hired to do voiceover roles on Star Trek. He did appear twice on screen, once in Bread and Circuses, and once as a newscaster in the episode Patterns of Force. You would also have heard his voice as Trelane's father in The Squire of Gothos. He was one of the providers in The Gamesters of Triskelion, and he was also an Excalbian in The Savage Curtain. LaRue was a character actor who worked in quite a lot of Hollywood productions in the 60s and 70s. He was an independent writer and filmmaker, which he continued to do up until his premature death at the age of 57 in 1990. Number 4. Spock's family ties to the Guardian. In the novel Yesterday's Son by A.C. Crispin, Spock travels back using the Guardian to Sarpedon, the episode that we first saw in All Our Yesterdays. Now that is a late episode of season 3 of the original series, but hold on, don't let that put you off just yet. In that episode, Spock, McCoy and Kirk travel through time, and Spock ends up enjoying some ponfar, shall we say, with Zara Beth, a native of Sarpedon 5,000 years before. In the beginning of this story, a drawing of a Vulcan face is discovered on Sarpedon. Spock reckons that, okay, yeah, I think that might have been my fault. He petitions T'Pau and gets permission to use the Guardian of Forever to travel back in time and collect his son. This he does. His son is named Zar, and he brings him into the modern times as well. Now, unfortunately, the Romulans have become aware of the Guardian of Forever by this point, and there is a space battle overhead between the Enterprise and the Lexington and some Romulans, while down on the planet, quickly Kirk and Spock are captured and tortured by Romulans. Zar has slightly advanced telepathic powers. He is able to, find his father and his father's greatest friend, basically his uncle, using only his mind. He does elect to go back to Sarpedon though at the end, but not before sharing a mind meld with Spock. Number 3, it has ties to the Q continuum. Now this is another beta canon entry, so just beta canon warning there. But in the novels, the Q Continuum set of novels by Greg Cox, it's revealed that the Q we know and love, the John Delancey Q, is actually well aware of the Guardian, and in his youth, relative youth, had in fact tried to use the Guardian to just discover something new. This ties into, of course, the episode Death Wish from Voyager, which shows the Continuum is old and dusty and they're bored, they've done everything. Now it does in the novel universe, it opens up the Milky Way galaxy to utter devastation. Q meets a character called O. O is completely genocidal and unfortunately has the power to back it up. Thanks a bunch, Q. Now thankfully, obviously that is rectified, but there is one statement that really sticks out and it's really important for the history of the Guardian, and that is Q's line that says about the Guardian, at least our ancestors knew how to make things, thus implying that the ancestors of the Q Continuum built the Guardian of Forever. Number 2, what's a little copyright theft between friends? When Kirk, Spock and the rest of the landing party are on the Guardian's planet and they're looking at the device, they see something like a show reel of images from the past in the middle section of the Guardian. These comprised of clips that were largely owned by Desilu Studios at the time, but not all of them. The clips are all from Paramount Films and RKO Pictures productions as well. Now, RKO was founded in 1929 by David Sarnoff, but by 1959 it had closed up its doors, it had shut down. Much of RKO's holdings were bought by Desilu Studios, but crucially, its past inventory of films, its back catalogue, wasn't. There are a couple of scenes in this showreel in The Guardian, including there's a sailing ship firing cannons. Now that is from the RKO film The Spanish Man from 1939. That was not used with permission. There was a bit of a legal grey area there, but to be fair, Desilu did not own that image to share it. As any content creator will know, you've got to have the rights to use images if you're going to, or that's got to be released under fair use laws. Neither of those were the case back in 1966 and 1967. So yeah, this is one episode that, at least legally, hasn't aged very well. Number 1, Sarek and Surak, the untold Yesterday's Enterprise. The original idea for the episode that would become Yesterday's Enterprise actually focused on a very different story altogether. There would still be time travel, and this is where the Guardian of Forever is brought in. But instead of the Enterprise traveling through any rifts, it would see Sarek traveling through the Guardian back in time. Now, once again, you've got people studying the Guardian of Forever. This time it's a Vulcan science team. They accidentally erase Surak from Vulcan's past. They accidentally kill him. Now, the problem with that is Surak is the person responsible for the Vulcans' current logical and peaceful way of life. He led them in the time of awakening. Without him, the Vulcans effectively make the Romulans look like kittens. Sarek elects to go back in time and take the place of Surak in history, basically becoming him, taking his name, and setting everything to right. This was an idea that would, at least thematically, be reused again in the Deep Space Nine episode Past Tense, which unfortunately did not feature the Guardian, but did feature Sisko taking on the role of Gabriel Bell. You can see as well the way some of the themes carried over into the released Yesterday's Enterprise. Gone was the Guardian of Forever, but kept was this idea of a contemporary character traveling back in time, although rather than the Vulcan Sarek, it was of course Tasha Yar traveling back on the Enterprise C.